The studio lights bathed the stage in a sterile glow as the audience leaned forward in anticipation. The set of The Late Show had welcomed countless guests before, but tonight carried a weight that no one could quite put into words. Stephen Colbert, perched in his chair with his signature smirk, prepared for an interview that was supposed to be an homage to Clint Eastwood's legacy. What unfolded instead would become one of the most controversial moments in televised history. Clint Eastwood sat upright, his posture rigid, his weathered face unreadable beneath the haze of the lights. He wasn't a man used to being interrupted, especially not by someone who made a living poking holes in everything he believed in. From the beginning, the conversation tiptoed around sensitive themes. Stephen, in his typical fashion, veiled criticism behind jokes, tapping into the generational and political divide between them. He saw it as satire, but to Clint, it reeked of disrespect. The audience chuckled as Stephen landed a few carefully sharpened jabs at Clint's recent comments on the state of American masculinity. Clint answered bluntly with a quiet intensity that didn't ask for respect. It demanded it. The tension simmered just beneath the surface, like a fuse being slowly lit. The room felt charged, not with laughter but with unease. As the conversation shifted from films to Clint's views on patriotism and personal responsibility, Stephen pressed harder. He questioned the relevance of Eastwood's traditional values in today's society, hinting at obsolescence. Clint didn't flinch. He sat motionless for a moment, then responded with a cold calm that cut through the air like steel. His tone wasn't raised, but his words struck with the kind of force only a man who has seen decades of cultural change could deliver. Stephen leaned back, his smirk faltering ever so slightly. This was no longer entertainment. It was a confrontation. He fired back, this time abandoning the comedic veil altogether. What had started as a generational clash of perspectives had now turned personal. He accused Clint of romanticizing a past that was never as noble as he claimed. That was the moment everything shifted. Clint's jaw tightened. The accusation struck deeper than anyone expected. There was no shrug, no deflection. His response was a blow not of volume, but of substance. It wasn't just about political ideology anymore. It was about respect. Clint began dismantling Stephen's persona on live television, not with insults, but with brutal honesty and fierce conviction. The kind of truth that silences a room. The audience grew uncomfortable. Laughter had disappeared. The space between them, once a desk and two chairs, now felt like a battlefield. And still, neither man relented. The conversation had evolved into a full-blown argument, not between a host and a guest, but between two embodiments of opposing worlds, one rooted in stoicism, the other in satire. What no one realized yet was that this was only the beginning. The gloves had come off, and both men were now staring across a line that neither seemed willing to retreat from. Respect had been challenged, legacy had been questioned, and the storm was just getting started. The silence that lingered after Clint's sharp retort wasn't the kind that settled. It crackled. The audience sat still, many unsure whether to laugh or gasp. The studio, typically a space for light jabs and easy applause, had become something else entirely. Stephen adjusted in his seat, as if trying to regain control, but the balance of power had already shifted. Clint wasn't playing by the usual late-night rules, and Stephen could feel it. Rather than backing off, Stephen made a choice that surprised even his crew. He doubled down. The debate pivoted toward the treatment of minorities in Clint's older films, with Stephen accusing him of perpetuating outdated stereotypes. Clint's eyes narrowed. It was clear that the attack wasn't just professional, it was personal. He took a slow breath, not out of patience, but preparation. This wasn't unfamiliar territory for Clint, but the disrespect on national television hit a nerve that had long been buried beneath decades of composure. What followed wasn't defensive. It was an offense delivered with surgical precision, Clint dismantled Stephen's criticism not with denials, but with brutal recollection, reminding him of the cultural context in which his films had been made, and the hypocrisy in judging the past by the warped lens of modern moral high ground. His voice never rose, but every word was a slap against the patronizing tone Stephen had adopted. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as Clint's words became heavier, darker, more laced with years of resentment toward the media's habit of rewriting history. Stephen, taken aback by the depth and sharpness of Clint's pushback, tried to inject levity. A forced laugh, a weak quip, both fell flat. The man sitting across from him wasn't rattled, he was resolute. And Stephen, for all his charm and wit, had miscalculated. What he saw as moral righteousness came off as arrogance. Clint smelled the weakness and went for the kill, not with rage, but with conviction sharpened by decades of scrutiny. The show's producers exchanged glances behind the scenes, some panicking as the tone of the segment veered far off script. The teleprompter sat abandoned, and the cue cards were useless. This wasn't a scheduled debate, it was a live reckoning. Viewers at home weren't getting entertainment. They were watching something raw, maybe even dangerous. And they couldn't. Look away. Stephen's tone shifted. No longer smug, but agitated. He accused Clint of being emblematic of a generation that refused to change. It was a statement laced with contempt, and it landed like a punch. Clint didn't blink. Instead, he leaned forward, eyes fixed, as if daring Stephen to repeat himself. It wasn't posturing. It was a challenge from a man who had stood his ground. Longer than most had been alive. The moment was thick with tension. You could hear the creak of Stephen's chair as he repositioned, trying to regain his footing, trying to turn the segment back into a show instead of a reckoning. But Clint wouldn't give him that escape. He spoke again, this time calling out Stephen's entire platform. Not just his words, but the machine behind them. The curated virtue, the manufactured outrage, the branding of moral superiority that shifted with the trends. Stephen was stunned. His eyes darted to the camera, then back to Clint. But there was nowhere to hide. He was being stripped down in real time, and the studio audience could feel it. Clint hadn't shouted once, but somehow the force of his presence had taken over the room. The audience was now silent, not out of discomfort, but reverence. They were witnessing something they didn't quite expect, humiliation not born of mockery, but of truth. The live feed continued rolling, the segment now over time, but no one dared cut it. The control room was frozen. Stephen leaned back, out of retorts, the laughter gone from his eyes. Clint sat like a mountain, unmoving, unshaken, and unwilling to be diminished by clever editing or polished wit. And just when it seemed like things might settle, Stephen said something that ensured they wouldn't. Something about Clint's family, about legacy. And in doing so, he didn't just cross the line, he buried it. The air shifted instantly. Stephen's words about Clint's family, veiled in irony and dressed as commentary, struck a nerve deeper than any political jab or cultural dig ever could. It was a step too far, and everyone in the studio felt it. Clint didn't explode. He simmered, like a fault line seconds before eruption. His eyes locked onto Stephen with a look that could pierce stone, not of anger in the theatrical sense, but of a deep, controlled fury that made the hairs on the back of every neck in the room stand up. Clint rose slightly in his chair. Not enough to stand, but enough to break the frame of passivity. He spoke low and slow, but the weight in his voice now carried something dangerous. History, loss, pride, and pain, all coiled tightly into a man who had built his life on unshakable principles. He called out Stephen's cowardice for hiding behind cleverness, for mocking things sacred to others, for trading real conviction for applause. The words hit with the kind of force that made people shift in their seats. Not from discomfort, but from awe. Stephen tried to maintain composure, but the smirk was long gone. He snapped back defensively, his voice raised, now agitated and raw. No longer in control of the room, he accused Clint of hiding behind the past, of refusing to adapt, of clinging to outdated myths. But his voice cracked slightly, betraying the pressure. He wasn't just sparring anymore, he was scrambling. Clint didn't move. He let the tension hang, let Steven spiral, then delivered a verbal blow that made the entire room inhale at once. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, it was honest. He spoke about the difference between building something and tearing it down, about how it was easier to mock a man than to become one, and how character was proven not through applause, but through silence and endurance. It wasn't just a rebuke. It was a dismantling of everything Steven thought gave him the upper hand. The audience sat paralyzed. Some leaned forward, captivated. Others turned away, as if watching something too intimate, too raw. The show's energy had transformed. What began as theater had become truth, unfiltered and unscripted. And Steven, once the conductor of every moment on his stage, now looked like a man completely out of his depth. A few on the crew whispered about cutting the segment, but no one acted. It was too late to contain what had been unleashed. Viewers at home were tweeting, recording, and speculating in real time. Clint Eastwood, a man who rarely gave interviews, had chosen this moment to strike back, not just at a host, but at a system that had reduced dignity to spectacle. Steven's rebuttal grew more frantic. His voice rose again, trying to regain the audience. But the laughter was gone. Every attempt to redirect or diffuse only exposed the cracks further. He tried to pivot to lighter ground, to reset the tone, but Clint wasn't interested in moving on. He calmly called it what it was: evasion. He pointed out the cracks in Steven's arguments, the laziness behind the satire, the shallowness behind the performance. Not with malice, but with precision. And that's what made it hurt. It was no longer about politics or values. It was about authenticity. And Clint, in that moment, was the embodiment of it. Even those who disagreed with his stance couldn't deny the raw sincerity he carried. Meanwhile, Steven looked diminished, not because he had lost a debate, but because he had underestimated the man sitting across from him. Then Clint did something unexpected. He stood. Slowly, with intent, and without raising his voice, he delivered a final remark, one that didn't insult, but ended the conversation. It was the kind of line that didn't need repeating. Everyone in the room understood its weight. It wasn't for laughs, it wasn't for headlines. It was for truth. And with that, Clint stepped off the stage. Not storming, not stomping, but walking tall, the way only someone with nothing left to prove could. The room remained still, caught between the echoes of confrontation and the silence of resolution. Steven sat frozen. The show was still live, the cameras still rolling, but all he could do was stare at the empty chair where Clint had just been. And somewhere in that silence, it became clear. He hadn't just lost an argument. He had been exposed. The silence that lingered after Clint's exit wasn't the kind that passed. It settled in, thick and permanent. Steven sat unmoving, eyes locked on the space Clint had just vacated, as if expecting him to return. But there was no return. There was no curtain call. Clint had said what he came to say, and the moment he stood, he took every ounce of dignity in the room with him. The control room scrambled, unsure whether to cut to commercial or end the broadcast. But nothing about the show that night had gone according to plan. The producers let the cameras roll just a few seconds longer, capturing Steven's blank stare, before finally fading the screen to black. No laughter, no applause, no catchy outro music. Just an abrupt end to a segment that would be dissected for weeks to come. Backstage, the atmosphere was no better. The usual buzz of a post-show crew turned into murmured disbelief. Staff who had once admired Steven's sharp wit now avoided his gaze. They weren't angry. They were shaken. Something had been broken during that exchange, and not just the illusion of control. For the first time in a long while, Stephen had been challenged not by someone trying to win a soundbite, but by a man who demanded respect and refused to let showmanship silence truth. Stephen retreated to his dressing room, slamming the door behind him. Alone with his thoughts, he replayed every moment, every line. He had gone into that interview confident that Clint would stumble, that age and ideology would leave him exposed and outdated. But he was wrong. Clint hadn't stumbled. He had stood, tall. He had pushed back. And he had left Stephen fumbling to justify a performance that now looked hollow in comparison. Meanwhile, Clint walked through the studio's back hallway with the same calm presence he brought to the stage. No theatrics, no smug grin. Just the quiet self-assurance of a man who had spoken his mind and stood his ground. The staff who passed him in the hallway didn't dare stop him. Some offered nods, others just stepped aside. Not out of fear, but respect. What they had witnessed wasn't a meltdown. It was a reckoning. By morning, the internet was ablaze. Clips of the exchange circulated like wildfire. News headlines read more like battle summaries than entertainment recaps. Social media was split. Some praised Stephen for holding Clint accountable, others applauded Clint for refusing to be belittled. But one thing was clear: no one was talking about anything else. The confrontation had transcended the confines of entertainment. It had become a moment. And within that moment, something shifted. For Clint, it was never about making a comeback or proving relevance. It was about standing firm in the face of a culture that too often confused mockery with courage. For Stephen, the fallout was harder to navigate. The public saw the cracks, they saw past the jokes, and many began to question whether the charm and intellect that once made him untouchable now masked a deeper arrogance. Days later, Clint was asked to comment by reporters waiting outside a private event. He didn't offer sound bites or clever remarks. He simply nodded and walked on. There was nothing left to explain. His actions had already spoken louder than any camera could capture. Stephen, on the other hand, took to his show the following week with a noticeably different tone. He acknowledged the encounter briefly, and with a shadow of humility. But the sharpness in his delivery had dulled. The audience sensed it. Something in him had changed, not entirely, but just enough to matter. The legacy of that fiery debate would live far beyond the walls of the studio. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about the clash of two worlds, one steeped in history and grit, the other molded by modernity and spectacle. And in that collision, truth had found its moment. Not by force, not by outrage, but by one man refusing to bend. In the end, Clint Eastwood didn't just walk off a stage. He walked into the hearts of those who still believed in conviction over applause, respect over performance, and the power of silence when it finally speaks.